Hello and welcome virtually to SpearTip Security Operations Center. My name is Jonathan Tock and I'm a Senior Director here at SpearTip. I oversee incident response and operations delivery here in the Operations Center. And today we have a very well-known chair member of Louis Brisbois' data privacy and cybersecurity practice, Mr. Hoar. And a little bit about Sean, as Sean served as the lead cyber attorney for the U.S. Attorney's Office in Oregon and holds numerous cybersecurity certifications. Sean has also received numerous accolades from the FBI, Secret Service, IRS, and DEA, not including all of the partners that we've worked together on and all of that feedback. So really appreciate having you here today, Sean.
It's my pleasure, Jonathan. Thank you.
Yeah. Absolutely, and the reason we wanted to get together and put this together is to really focus around specifically around the recent Microsoft Exchange vulnerabilities being exploited originally by the Hafnium group, and now it appears being exploited by a number of threat actors, and really go over what people should know, what they can do, and even for those not affected, what can they take away and what can they learn from this type of mass exploitation event. So maybe to get started, in your opinion, how did so many companies get hit by the same exploit? The latest numbers are saying as many as 80,000 companies were affected.
Well, as you know, one of the challenges is that the bad guys are truly malicious, and unfortunately, they're very well resourced and persistent. And we saw, as you saw, probably 16, 18 months ago, they started strategically going after what we call high-value targets, managed service providers, and then at some point we started to see major incidents with regard to supply chain hacks. And of course, everybody's familiar with SolarWinds now. And so the reality is the malicious actors have always attempted to find vulnerabilities that will allow them into an operations system for different purposes, and sometimes we see a lot of this, the monetization of the data in different ways. And in this case, it's the reason we've got so many, of course, is that you've got a part of a system, if you will. You've got a server that is unfortunately part of many information systems across the world, and as a result, the bad guys know that should be a big target, and when they have the opportunity to develop a vulnerability, they're going to take it and run with it. And we have seen, unfortunately, those that remain unpatched for a few days after the alert came out. We've seen now multiple actors, given cases we're working right now, come in and start to deploy different variants of malware or ransomware. So it's going to be more serious, and I expect those who have been affected recognize it now, but it's just one of many that will come down the road, I expect.
Yeah, and many times we see companies want to use the same tools as other companies are leveraging, right? And just having the same technology is not always the best route to go. Even if you were patched all the way up to the most recent patch, you would have still been affected by this vulnerability. When it originally there was nothing to really help with that when it originally started being attacked and being leveraged across the board.
Well, I think one of the things this points out, though, is that there are obviously, as you know, many parts to an information security program. One of those parts is patch management, making sure that you're identifying patches when they need to be installed, and then having a process set up for immediate deployment of them. But sometimes they have to be tested to make sure they don't, quote unquote, break other things in your system. And so sometimes things are kind of put on a shelf, if you will, for maybe a day or two or three, while other patches are being applied to different systems depending on the size of the enterprise. What this tells us is that this needs to be at the forefront. There needs to be a conduit for patch management, so every enterprise, regardless of how big or small it is, has to really put this at the forefront as part of a layered defense. Now, everybody, when we talk about it, sure, everybody recognizes it's part of that layered defense, but we really need to put it at the front because bad guys are utilizing these exploits very, very quickly, and even those that didn't create it but are watching for these patches to come out, they know they're watching just like every business owner, and when they see that, they're going to start scanning for them, recognizing there will be a certain percentage of businesses that simply do not have the resources to apply them, and they'll be looking for those vulnerable servers, ports, or whatever, what might otherwise need that patch. So I guess the silver lining is that it's teaching us in information security that this stuff really is serious, and that we really do need to have systems in place for patch management, and we need to make sure you got the resources to get it in place quickly.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I'm going to pull kind of two things from what you said there. Defense in depth or layered defense is patch management is a part of it, but so much more than that too, right? We looked at SolarWinds or Microsoft Exchange, and in both times we find cases where there were abnormalities in the environment, where a new IP that, had would have shown up in your firewall, a web shell that wouldn't have existed previously. And in the SolarWinds attack, you have a malware attempting to run and running in memory. So you've got things that patching would have helped. And in the SolarWinds case, patching actually was the opposite, because if you were up to date, then
Right.
it means you did get hit. So patching is only one piece, but it is extremely important. The second piece is watching for changes, having the right things in place. So when those things change, when that happens, it's absolutely there. So I think that's kind of the first part. And the second part is just that entire, as you mentioned, where do you take it from there? What do you continue to roll out and continue to do better when you see these types of attacks happening? Because these types of attacks are not just hitting high-value targets, right? In this case, it was a high-value target because so many of the exploits were available. But have you seen, common industries being hit through Hafnium? Are you seeing any commonality across who it seems to be targeting?
We've had, and I don't have the exact number, and I should have pulled it before this, Jonathan, but we are probably approaching 75 to 100 cases so far that our team is working in the last, 7 to 10 days, or whatever the time frame has been, whatever day of the month it is. And so, it seems as though it is crossing all business sectors. It's crossing all sizes, whether it's Fortune 50 or 100, or relatively small startup, where every there are many businesses of many sizes that have, unfortunately, Microsoft Exchange servers. I mean, I shouldn't say unfortunate, because they've obviously served a purpose for many businesses for some time, but unfortunately everybody that has them now, those four versions, had the exploit. And so we don't see, quite frankly, any commonalities showing yet. And it's just going to be a question of whether they start to emerge later. The commonality we see, however, is that if in fact you were affected and you didn't patch immediately, then what we're finding is that bad guys were scanning, and we've got fairly sophisticated actors coming in to utilize that to exploit systems through the ransomware process. And that's the big lesson here, is that, once again, you got to get that patch on there quickly. Now, even with Microsoft Exchange, even if you had the patch on initially, there's still some remediation measures you have to take. In that case, of course, they develop scripts to go back and scan for other indicators of compromise. But that comes back to the layered defense thing. We've got this. You and I have talked about this before. Endpoint detection and response tools, and nowadays, it used to be a luxury spend. Even just 18, 24 months ago, it's like, well, yeah, we'll get to that, but it costs too much. Well, it's necessary now. This is InfoSec 101. You can't wait around for it. You need to have it deployed to every endpoint that has any connectivity to the internet, or you will become a victim. They're going to get inside your perimeter, and you won't know it. And the difference, as you know, is that especially with a heuristic-based EDR tool or endpoint detection and response tool, you're going to see not just malware, but malicious activity or involving legitimate applications. And that's the whole key here, is that, like you say, watch for changes. Do you have a baseline? Great. Even if you don't, look for other changes. Are there things, are you being used in combination with one another that appear to be malicious, that don't have any otherwise legitimate purpose? And kabam, you need a tool that will detect that now.
Right, and security event containment, and that's kind of what you're describing from the technical side. Is it's not only having an endpoint detection response tool, but when you get an alert, going through and actually taking it through the entire response lifecycle, knowing where it came from. Because if it does point back to a web shell on Outlook before you know everything that's going on here, that's unusual. That needs to be fully captured. You need to know what it talked to, what it touched, what it went to, and in a best case scenario, you're alerted right when that IP attempts to go out, or right when that web shell is placed on your Exchange server. But having those multiple defenses to be able to see that, and just to go back to the common industries, we're seeing the same thing. So from our side, I'd say similar number of total incidents that we're working, and we're not seeing it pick just education or just healthcare, just finance, anything like that. It seems to really be anyone initially that they could get in and potentially attack. We did see some false positive attacks because there were changes or because people had done things uniquely that did not get hit, but pretty much across the board, it seemed anyone that they could hit or that was available, they tried to. But you hit the nail on the head of if they didn't do anything, if your company wasn't watching threat intelligence or frankly just watching cyber news in any way, because it was all that was talked about for about 3.5 days from the 11th on, and you didn't move or you didn't think that anything was necessary, then yeah, your chances of getting hit with ransomware, or worse, someone being in the environment right now that hasn't deployed ransomware yet, it went up tenfold, I would say.
Yep. Yes. Absolutely.
Yeah. And as a cyber breach attorney, why does this type of event, worry you, or these mass exploitation events? What should companies be thinking about that they may just not be thinking about yet?
Well, I see, you see everything that comes in the door in terms of all the exploits that are being purveyed out there by malicious actors. And I think at the very, very top is an encryption attacks combined with extortion, in that not only are they going to encrypt literally your business model, the data that you utilize for your livelihood, regardless how big or small a business you are, to the extent that they not only do that, but they also steal sensitive information from you prior to executing the encryption attack, and then try to extort you twice over, if you will, for that. Just extremely dangerous. It violates, obviously, the privacy. It increases your liability. It puts a whole new perspective, if you will, on third-party liability and the cost to not just restore your system, but reputational damage, et cetera. It has all kinds of other implications that businesses have hard time visualizing unless they've done a lot of preparation or unless they've been through it. So that's where other parts of an information security program, like that incident response planning, very, very basic, foundational, but to make sure that takes into consideration the new world, the new encryption attacks, the new exfiltration exploitation factor. And what do you do in that situation? And how do you respond? And do you negotiate? Have you had that philosophical conversation? And if so, what resources do you use? What are the laws with regard to that? Do you have to do sanctions check and comply with Treasury laws? Do you report to the FBI? All those things. And then at the same time, the whole notification process. Well, how does that implicate consumer and regulatory notification and the whole breach risk assessment process and the risk harm assessment under various statutes? I mean, it just brings a whole panoply of things that businesses, unless they're prepared for it, it's going to be a very, very fast-moving ship once it happens.
Yeah, and how often have we unfortunately seen companies and business owners have to make that decision or have that discussion for the first time at 7:30 on a Friday night or
Yes.
8:30 on a Saturday night. They're deciding, even some basic things like how much is it actually costing the company to be down? Because as we know,
Yep.
paying a ransom doesn't mean that tomorrow at noon you're going to be up and running and everything's, making the decision, I should say, to pay does not mean that you're going to be up and running in the next 12 hours. There's still,
Exactly.
it takes time to decrypt, sometimes 3 to 5 times as long as it took to initially encrypt, and not everything is always able to be decrypted. There's all kinds of issues that come with it, and yeah, those are all things, and at a fundamental level, it's having the right plan and people in place. I think that's a piece that gets overlooked so often. How do you have the right partners in place? It starts mostly with cyber insurance, but then having someone like yourselves, a breach attorney in place, having a forensic firm that you have on retainer, or at least you have their phone number to call when things get out of hand, so that you're not turning all of your computers off and wasting all of this data or having your logs roll over. From our side, that's the constant battle in the forensics world, is how do we make sure that the right steps are taken so that everything's usable and we can really get through that. And in your world, making sure that they're not reaching out to all of their clients or reaching out to partners prematurely without the right information or without the
Right.
Knowing what their obligations are, if that's not the case, if they don't have to do that, knowing what they have to do versus what they should do or what's best practice.
Right. No, it's so important, and I think that one of the keys too is that it's part of what you've just said there. One of the challenges of managing an incident response is not just working with like your team to make sure forensics are deployed immediately, that you're utilizing an EDR tool for different purposes to try to contain and then acquire your digital evidence for analysis and really start to figure out where the bad guys came in, what they did, what they impacted. But then it becomes really the notice issue and the communications issue. And I think one of the biggest sources of liability that a lot of businesses don't realize is the contracts. and the contracts or agreements oftentimes have a very quick notification provision to their clients. And if you get a very big business, international business, sometimes they will have thousands of contracts that they've never realized had a notice provision dealing with a data security incident. And all of a sudden, we have to stand up a team to start parsing through those provisions to make sure they're not in breach of contract, so they don't have any other economic impacts, unforeseen impacts, just simply based on the violation of a notice provision. But then it also goes to how do we notify our employees? What clients do we notify, and how do we do that, because we don't know much? And so the communication takes on a whole different context where we want to make sure that we're doing the right thing, right? Notifying those who should be, but never saying anything more than we know, and no more than we have to, because the reality is, if in fact you are inaccurate in any way, you're going to have to walk that back. It's going to cause confusion, sometimes anxiety, sometimes hostility, and you really want to be careful in the breach context, because quite frankly, less said is the better. And I know sometimes that gives people anxiety, but the reality is you don't want to have any missteps, and oftentimes that external communication is where the misstep occurs.
Absolutely, and we'll use Marriott as just one publicly known example, of someone who consistently changed what they said about an event. It continued to, the narrative continued to change, which caused confusion. It caused people to get more upset about everything that was going on. I mean, I think we saw similar with Equifax data numbers. They continued to grow as they learn more data, and sometimes over transparency isn't always the best case, because if you don't know exact numbers, you don't want to, I always say, you don't want to stay at the top of the newspaper. Every time you update those numbers or you update what you're saying, you're moving back up to the top, and staying relevant after a breach is not something that typically a company wants to do.
In the past, you saw this, a couple of years ago, where they would do, just kind of drive-by ransomware, where it wasn't targeted. It was maybe 50,000 email phishing messages were sent out, hoping that 3 to 5% would click on it, and it would start to get encrypted. But even then, they weren't really looking at decrypting backups. They were just trying to get what they could. And then at some point, they got more sophisticated. But now, literally, we've seen where they're not only research and development in terms of the code, their deployment, the reconnaissance, the tools, but then if in fact a business actually restores from their own backups, say you've got gap backups following best practices, and you don't commence communication with the bad actors, and you actually get operational quickly, well, now we're seeing literally the bad guys will come back weeks later, posing sometimes as maybe a reporter, asking about that hack you had when nobody in the outside world did, and then they ultimately disclose that they're actually the attackers, and they come back and try to have you pay ransom, because they actually still have data that you didn't pay for a month ago. So what we're seeing is their collections units, really, quite frankly, just like a business. They've got everything. They get the marketing and communications. As you know, they'll release a press release when they do something significant. They have their shaming sites to make sure they're getting traction by what I call the dark web trolls and their tweet storms. But then you've also got their collections unit that come back, and marketing and communications that are combined with it to get, through social engineering to get back in your door and cause you to pay ransom. So it's something I would have never imagined a few years ago, but they're unfortunately full service criminal business models.
No, yeah, and I actually spoke with Thomas Moran around Maze about maybe a year and a half ago, and we were talking about how, okay, they're starting to post data, and they're doing it almost every case, and how big of a change that is. But now we almost run from the assumption right off the beginning that they're going to post data, and we most forensic firms, we have a whole list of sites that we're constantly monitoring and scraping for that data to make sure that partners know when it's changed. I mean, all of that has happened in such a short time frame. That development and how quickly they're able to implement those things is obviously well funded from the number of ransoms that are paid, but something that they're going to continue to do. They're going to continue to try to see what ways can we pinch to get 10% more ransoms paid, just like a company would, to try to move up or grow. So just incredible. And I think to bring it back to the Hafnium engagement, you're seeing the same thing. RDP, remote desktop protocol being open, is something that we see on still a large majority of incidents, but I think Microsoft has changed vulnerabilities. Obviously, this month have been a large first place to look, but I think it's going to continue to see these exploited and see them as a way in, even for the next few months to come.
Yes, I agree. And we see as you know, like you just referenced, the biggest attack vectors previously were, spear phishing attack perhaps, but also compromising the remote desktop protocols through RDP, through that open port, RDP port, and those are just two of the attack vectors. Now you've got others, of course, And so businesses really do need to make sure that you're reviewing on a regular basis the security controls they have in place, making sure their systems are properly configured, making sure they've got some automated ways in which they can do that, but also periodically manually check. It's the whole backup system. It's, as you know, so critical. And we talked about multi-factor authentication, I think maybe endpoint detection and response tools and proper configuration of firewalls, but even really make sure you've got a very complex backup process and that you're manually checking. It's one thing to have automated checks that says, yeah, it looks like it's got integrity, but we've seen situations where, unfortunately, the bad actors had actually corrupted the system, so the reports that we're getting were false. And you've got to actually periodically do manual checks to make sure that the data is what it purports to be,
100%.
so that you're not going to go looking for it and find that it's not there or it's not what you thought it was.
And you know how long it takes to come back. That's the other question. How long would it take you? And companies need to ask themselves this. If all of these systems were encrypted, how long would it take you to restore from backup? Because that's going to be factored into whether you're looking at paying the ransom, what the timelines look like with that. And they always teach you, I come from an IT background, and one of the first things they teach you is your backups are only good as the last time that you restored from a backup. So if you haven't restored in 9 months, then your backups may be 9 months old, because you do have so many different ways to back things up and get the backups off the network. That's the other thing that, it's good to maybe have intermittent be on the network, but get them away from your environment, get them to the cloud or get them to somewhere else. And so that kind of brings up the next point of, in this case, if you had Office 365, if you were using Gmail, if you were in the cloud, you weren't affected by this vulnerability. Is in your opinion, is there a push to the cloud? Is moving more to the cloud better from a legal strategy and a risk strategy?
Well, the challenge is, and I'm a proponent that we want to do whatever it is to get things to be more secure, but I'm also a proponent of not putting all our eggs in one basket. We've seen that where everybody puts something in one environment, and that environment gets compromised, and they're dead in the water. And so, even in a cloud environment, to make sure that if you do that it's very, very well segmented and you've got all the security controls in place. But if not, make sure that you've got things securely, but maybe not all in the one place, maybe not all the same provider, if that works for your business model. Just because if one goes down, you want to have some resiliency, and that's where the whole backup process comes into play as to where are your repositories, and how will you survive if one goes down? Are you going to have redundant repositories to help you move forward? So I'm a proponent of doing whatever it takes to become more secure, and the cloud is certainly one of the solutions, but it's not the panacea, and we have to be careful how we plan it.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've worked a number of business email compromise engagements, as I know Brisbois does. And so it's not, okay, we're in the cloud, we don't have to worry about cybersecurity anymore, right? Just like having an on-premise Exchange server doesn't mean you don't need endpoint detection response tools and having those places, and having a security operations center actually looking at those alerts and figuring out exactly what happened. Because no matter what, if you're in Office 365, no matter where you're at, if you're holding data, and at this point, even if you're a two-person shop that's a CPA firm, you're at risk, and you're holding things that are valuable to these actors. So it doesn't matter how big or how small you are, you're potentially gonna get hit by these types of events, or you will get hit by these types of events sooner or later.
Well, no, and what's interesting is even in, say, the Amazon cloud, where you've got the new vernacular, you've got E2 instances or S3 buckets, and people think that, well, it's new, it's obviously more secure, and it's got some fancy language, some stuff I haven't heard before, so it must be really good. Well, we have seen the bad guys do so much with that configuration, and sometimes let's just say we never want to have a false sense of security. So regardless of how new it is, how secure it appears to be, make sure you do your due diligence, and make sure you're aware of your own security controls, because there will be inevitably security controls, I'll say, in the background, in layperson's language, if you will. But there's some on your side of the fence too. There always will be, and it's a matter of becoming familiar with what they are and what you control, and then making sure you enable those. Don't rely on defaults. The bad guys know what all the defaults are. But also, especially in a big cloud environment, make sure you've got a point of contact in that cloud environment should you need something in the case of emergency. We have been in situations where businesses could not get a hold of their account rep, if you will, in those big areas, and it's caused substantial business problems. And so it's just all part of the incident response plan. You got to walk through it, make sure you've got everything in place, including that communication piece with the cloud provider.
Well, I think you just hit a key difference between having a widget or an EDR tool and having a security operations center or having security standards is that if you move to, let's say, AWS or Azure and you start using those services, you may not have endpoints that you can actually put a tool on. You're now looking at services, you're looking at functions, you're looking at all new ways for you to potentially be exploited. You mentioned, S3 buckets and accidental misconfiguration as you move to these sort of systems. It's not as easy as just, well, we have EDR, why did we get hit with this? Or, well, we have MFA into our Amazon account, why did we get hit with this? You really have to continue to update that incident response plan as you update security, as you update technology. It's not something that you should ever save on your desktop and just, let it collect dust. The amount of times that, people have it on their desktop and have never printed out the incident response plan is something that still comes up, and then you get hit with ransomware and you can't get to it. You don't have your communication strategy. So test it, run through it, know what's going on there. So one last question, before we kind of wrap things up, and is cybersecurity, the only constant in cybersecurity is change. And this, these I'll call mass exploitation events like SolarWinds, like Microsoft Exchange, I think it's quickly becoming a trend in 2021. How do we, as a cybersecurity industry, both what you do and on our side, how do we keep up with everything?
That's one of the constant challenges, is right. Give us a few more hours every day.
Yeah.
I think the key is, and you referenced this earlier, is recognize that you can't do it all yourself. Regardless of the size of your business, you're going to rely upon some third-party resources, but make sure you know who they are. Do your due diligence and get your resources in place now, and make sure that you've got eyes on your environment, like you suggested a couple times, to have a good SOC. Now, a lot of businesses cannot afford a SOC, right? Maybe they don't need a SOC if they've got some other things in place, but make sure that just alerting, for instance, it's because there will be different things that occur. There'll be other what we call industry events, and just to make sure that you're doing everything you can to utilize the security you've got, the experts you've got, the other resources you've got, put your plans in place, and don't wait until the next quarter to do something if you can do it now. I don't know how many times, and I know you probably had the same experience where you're on the first crisis call with a client, and they said, you talk about multi-factor authentication. They say, oh yeah, we were just about ready to implement that.
Yeah.
Well, the bad guys exploited it. Yeah, yes, exactly. Or, well, gee, that's on our calendar as an initiative for Q4, and it's like, oh, darn it, I wish we would have done it in Q3. We wouldn't be, So we just want to make sure that if you can do it now, you do, and if you can't, make sure you've got to prioritize to move through it as quickly as you can. But I think in terms of paying it. How do you prepare for these things? I think also information sharing, making sure that if you're an information security professional, you've got your feeds, if you will, to kind of keep up to date, making sure, for instance, as you referenced, that on Tuesday night, March 2nd, I think it was, when the alert came out with Microsoft Exchange, make sure you're in a place where you're going to get that, so that you're constantly informed. You've got resources within and outside your organization to help you stay informed, but also help you stay in a place where you can implement those things that need to be installed. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think said very well. And I may be a little biased, but I think most companies can't afford an operations center. I think it's just a matter of priorities. But really, as we continue as the industry continues to grow, it's about having the right people. I mean, I think it always comes back to having the right partners. Who's reaching out when these types of events happen? And I know for all of our security operations partners and our continued partners, is we reach out immediately once we notice the scale and the potential for this type of attack. And so it's having those people in your corner, because there is no way you keep up with everything. I mean, I'm amazed every day by the changes and the new names and the different animal figure that we're using for this actor or that actor. But it's a matter of having the right partners that do understand that and live that day in and day out. It's not always an IT provider. I think that's one thing that a lot of people also will confuse. An IT and a security provider are different. They have different goals. IT wants everything to be up and working. Security security would rather everything be done. No, we would rather everything be secure
Right.
and doing
Right.
things appropriately. So it's just having those right people in your corner. But
You bet.
anything else that you wanted to add about the Microsoft Exchange or SolarWinds or any of these events that are occurring?
No. I appreciate the opportunity to chat with you. It's been fun, and I think just we do what you're doing right now is I know you some are if you will evangelists for information security, but I think the key is to do what we can to educate those about what we're learning along the way. We have a blog. I believe you as well. Do it and make sure that if we have the opportunity to teach because of something, let's teach. With the Microsoft Exchange matter, for instance, we relatively quickly put up a blog with some recommendations, and there'll be other exploits tomorrow and the next day. And those of us who are professionals in the area, we all play well together, and some of us work very hard together very well. And we just need to make sure that we're doing what we can to continue to educate and try to help others stay in front of that hard edge through thought leadership, whether it's blogs, newsletters, speaking engagements, to make sure that we're constantly educating to try to, as we harden our targets collectively, I guess in the aggregate, that makes it much harder, globally for the bad guys to continue to penetrate.
Absolutely. Yeah, we started the conversation talking about how they're continuing to develop and continuing to get better, and we have to do the same. We're only as good as we partner together, just like other companies should have partners in place. We all need to continue to get better and try to talk more about these issues and try to get these out as quickly as possible to keep talking about it, so that when the next one comes, because there's always a next one, we're better and we handle it in a better way and quicker, faster, stronger. But I really appreciate the time just talking through everything. I think we were able to get through quite a bit, and definitely hope to. I'm sure we'll spin around and talk more in the future as these continue to grow and continue to hit companies.
Look forward to it. Thanks, Jonathan. I appreciate it.
All right, thanks, Sean.